A man is fixing his brush machine when, suddenly, his wife asks why he put a scarecrow in an empty field. Harless glances at the scarecrow from a distance, and his face turns pale. He can't believe his eyes. Without hesitation, he jumps into his truck and drives to find his friends, Philby and Skeeter. He spots them at a local bar, drags a chair over, and sits down. Furious, Harless scolds them,
"Don't act dumb,"
accusing them of pulling a sick joke. He tells them the scarecrow isn't something to laugh about. As he describes what he saw, both Philby and Skeeter begin to sweat nervously. They swear they have nothing to do with it. Harless covers his mouth with his hand as a chilling realization hits him, as there's only one person who could have done this. Without wasting another moment, the three of them rush off to confront him. At the post office, the trio barges in and confronts Otis, who is visibly annoyed by their sudden arrival. But when they explain why they're there, Otis brushes it off, claiming someone must be playing a prank on them. But why is this one scarecrow causing so much fear and chaos among these men? To understand that, we need to rewind to a few weeks earlier, where an unlikely friendship begins to unfold. A friendship between a young girl and the town's misunderstood fool. Bubba and Marilee have formed a special bond that defies societal norms. Despite her young age and his developmental challenges, their friendship is pure and unbreakable. They spend their days in the fields, enjoying each other's company. Today, Marilee is teaching Bubba how to pick flowers and weave them into a beautiful lei. When she helps him place it around his neck, Bubba beams with happiness. But not everyone shares their joy. Otis, lurking nearby, watches them with dark intentions. He doesn't approve of their friendship because he has other plans for Marilee. Later that day, Otis sets out to deliver mail, but his mind is elsewhere. After watching Marilee and Bubba play, he stops at Harless's place. With a scheming tone, he tells Harless about Bubba spending time with Marilee. Harless grows furious, ready to teach Bubba a lesson. But Otis has a darker plan. He warns Harless that beating Bubba won't be enough. It never has been. Otis speaks from years of tormenting Bubba, knowing he always bounces back. This time, Otis wants a permanent solution. Harless hesitates. He doesn't want to go beyond roughing Bubba up unless Bubba does something bad first. Meanwhile, Bubba and Marilee are walking through the neighborhood when Marilee suddenly spots a beautiful fountain behind a fence. Her eyes light up with excitement as she notices a loose panel in the fence. Ignoring Bubba's warnings, she squeezes through and sneaks into the yard. Once inside, she runs around, marveling at the fountain and playing happily in the yard. But her joy is short-lived. Out of nowhere, a dog appears, barking aggressively and charging at her. Marilee screams in fear, and Bubba, unable to stand by, bursts through the fence to protect her. Despite his bravery, the dog manages to bite Marilee in a couple of spots before Bubba can intervene. Later, Bubba picks her up and carries her home. He knocks on her door, showing her injured body to her horrified mother, repeatedly saying, "Bubba didn't do it." Her mother lets out a piercing scream that echoes through the town. Word spreads quickly, and soon Harless rushes to the post office to tell Otis that Marilee is dead and that Bubba is responsible. Fueled by rage and without waiting for the sheriff's call for volunteers, Otis grabs his gun, determined to take justice into his own hands. They gather Skeeter and his dogs from the garage, along with Philby from his farm, and they set out to hunt Bubba down. Meanwhile, Bubba runs as fast as he can, heading to his mother's house, which is tucked away in an isolated area. He's terrified, and the men and their dogs are hot on his trail, the hounds sniffing the air and following his scent. Along the way, Philby stops briefly to take pills for his heart condition, but the group presses on. Bubba finally reaches his mother, collapsing to his knees in front of her. He swears he didn't harm Marilee and that men are chasing him and that he's scared for his life. Poor Bubba. His mother tells him she believes him, but she knows the danger isn't over. She urges him to find a safe place to hide, telling him the men will hurt him if they find him. It isn't long before the men arrive at the house, armed and ready. Otis calls out loudly, demanding Bubba to come out. Instead, Bubba's mother steps outside. The men accuse Bubba of harming Marilee, claiming they're acting on official business since the sheriff has called for volunteers. Bubba's mother denies their accusation, saying Bubba would never harm anyone. She insists she doesn't know where Bubba is and shuts the door in their faces. But Skeeter's dogs are restless. Picking up Bubba's scent, they lead the group to the backyard. The men search tirelessly, their eyes scanning every corner, but Bubba is nowhere to be found. Finally, the dogs stop, barking wildly at a scarecrow standing in the middle of the field. The men grow frustrated with the dogs for leading them astray, but Otis steps closer to the scarecrow, his eyes narrowing as he notices something strange. He gets closer and freezes. Inside the scarecrow's disguise is poor Bubba, gasping for breath, his eyes wide with terror and fear. Otis orders the others to step back. Slowly, they all raise their guns, aiming them at the helpless Bubba. Trembling, Bubba screams, "Bubba didn't do it!" but the men have already turned their hearts to stone. Without hesitation, they open fire, unleashing a hail of bullets which turn Bubba's body into a sieve. Blood pours from his wounds as he is executed in cold blood, with no witnesses to see the horror. Suddenly, Harless's radio warns them, saying the manhunt is over. Merrily has woken up in the hospital and is doing well. He adds that Bubba is a hero. If it weren't for him, the dog would have torn the girl apart. Realizing the horrible crime they've committed, panic sets in. Otis grabs a pitchfork and places it in Bubba's lifeless hands to make it look like he was armed. Suddenly, a strong wind begins to swirl around the field, and the men glance around nervously as the wind abruptly stops. Days later, District Attorney Sam brings the 4 men to court, determined to hold them accountable for manslaughter. He argues that their actions were unjustifiable. However, their lawyer presents the pitchfork as evidence, claiming the men acted in self-defense. Despite the fact that they fired 21 bullets into a defenseless Bubba, the judge rules in their favor. He declares them innocent, stating that they are valued members of the community and were simply responding to the sheriff's call. Bubba's mother screams uncontrollably as the law fails to bring her son justice. Meanwhile, the men rejoice, walking out of court as free men. That night, Merrily sneaks out of her bedroom. She hasn't seen Bubba in days and she's worried. She makes her way to his house and finds his mother sitting on the porch. Tearfully, his mother tells Merrily that Bubba's gone to a better place, where no man can ever hurt him and he's never coming back. But Merrily refuses to believe it. She insists that Bubba is simply hiding and that their days of playing together will return soon. Determined, Merrily heads to the garden, where she sings Bubba's favorite song. She smiles and tells his mother that Bubba is just playing the hiding game he is really good at. But little does Merrily know that hiding in the scarecrow cost Bubba his life. This is why seeing the scarecrow in his field leaves Harless in shock and torments his friends. However, Otis remains calm and confident, claiming that Sam is behind this, trying to manipulate them into doing something foolish and getting themselves arrested. He advises them to go home and warns them never to return here, as it might raise suspicion. Later that night, Harless returns to his farm and checks on it, but finds only the wooden frame where the scarecrow once stood. Confused and uneasy, Harless runs back to his barn. As he steps inside, he hears the sound of his brush machine suddenly running. Startled, he searches the area, wondering who could have turned it on, but finds no one. He switches it off and begins to climb up to the loft after hearing another strange noise. There, he spots a coffin sitting ominously in the shadows. Harless approaches the coffin, but before he can open it, the brush machine roars back to life. The loud noise startles him, and he loses his footing. Desperately, he grabs onto a lamp to steady himself, but it breaks under his weight. Harless falls straight into the machine, and in a horrific instant, his body is shredded into pieces. By morning, word of Harless's gruesome death spreads across the town. That night, Otis, Philby, and Skeeter meet at the post office. Otis tries to convince them it was nothing more than a tragic accident, but Philby and Skeeter are drenched in sweat as they are convinced that Bubba has returned from the grave to seek vengeance. The next day, Otis visits Bubba's mother while delivering the mail. He accuses her of being involved in Harless's death, but she denies it. With a calm yet ominous tone, she warns him,
"What you sow, so shall you reap."
She also warns him to stay away from Merrily, accusing him of watching her with ill intention. Later, Philby is working at his farm, filling one of his silos. Suddenly, he notices the scarecrow standing in the distance, watching him. His heart begins to pound furiously as fear grips him. Desperate to confirm if what he sees is real, he rushes toward it, but as he draws closer, his heart starts to fail. That evening, the town gathers for a lively Halloween party where Merrily and her friends play hide-and-seek, running and giggling through the crowd. Otis, lurking nearby, spots Merrily and approaches her. Despite her reluctance to talk to him, he presses on, claiming that Bubba's mother is behind the strange events happening to his friends. However, Merrily tells him that it was Bubba who did it. Otis grows furious at the mention of Bubba's name and tells her Bubba is dead. But Merrily calmly replies that she knows Bubba is dead and runs away. Next, Philby and Skeeter arrive at the Halloween party, their clothes stained with sweat. Philby recounts what he saw and leads them back to his barn, but to their horror, the scarecrow has vanished. Then Otis storms off to confront Bubba's mother. When he reaches her house, Otis accuses her of orchestrating the events. As she tries to scream for help, Otis panics and covers her mouth, accidentally killing her in the struggle. Realizing what he's done, Otis turns the gas stove on full blast and walks out of the house. Moments later, as the gas reaches the fireplace, the house erupts in a fiery explosion, leaving nothing behind that could incriminate him. The following night, Philby is startled awake by the sound of his pigs squealing in terror. Grabbing a flashlight, he heads outside to check on them. As he nears the barn, he notices the lights in his house suddenly go out. Fear grips him, and he quickly hides inside one of his silos. But as he crouches in the dark, he realizes he's trapped. Suddenly, the conveyor belt feeding the silo comes to life, and grain begins to pour in relentlessly. Philby pounds on the walls, screaming for help, but it's too late. The grain buries him alive, silencing his cries. The next morning, news of Philby's gruesome death reaches Skeeter, and he's overwhelmed with guilt and terror. Convinced that Bubba's ghost is behind it all, Skeeter tells Otis he wants to turn himself in. Otis insists that Marilee's claim might be true. Bubba could still be alive. He persuades Skeeter to come with him to check Bubba's burial site and settle the matter once and for all. That night, they sneak into the cemetery and dig up Bubba's grave. When they open the coffin, they find Bubba's body still inside. Skeeter is shaken and runs to confess everything to the authorities. But Otis, unwilling to let Skeeter jeopardize his freedom, convinces him to stay calm. As Skeeter reluctantly agrees and begins to close the coffin, Otis grabs a shovel and strikes him, killing him on the spot. Without hesitation, Otis buries Skeeter's body in the same grave and drives off into the night. While speeding away, Otis spots Marilee running through a pumpkin field. He slams on the brakes and chases after her, catching her in the middle of the field. Grabbing her arm, he accuses her of masterminding the Scarecrow murders. Suddenly, the loud roar of a combine machine fills the air. The massive machine starts up by itself, its blades shredding pumpkins into pulp. Otis panics and flees, stumbling and tripping over the uneven ground. As the combine grows closer, he accidentally runs into the Scarecrow standing menacingly in the field. The Scarecrow, holding the pitchfork, stands motionless as Otis barrels straight into it. Gasping for breath, Otis looks up at the Scarecrow in horror, finally realizing the truth. It was the Scarecrow all along, and Otis collapses to the ground. As the night settles, the Scarecrow calmly walks through the field and finds Marilee, who smiles after seeing him. Gently, the Scarecrow kneels down and hands her a flower just like she taught him. It becomes clear that Bubba's spirit, inhabiting the Scarecrow, has been behind the vengeance all along.